The courthouse doors closed behind me for the last time, and I stood on the steps breathing free air for the first time in 11 years. 11 years. I had spent 11 years behind bars, convicted of embezzling $2.3 million from the elementary school where I had been principal for 22 years. The prosecution said I had stolen from the children, from the lunch programs, from the special education funds. My own community believed I had betrayed every student who ever walked through those doors. I was Dr. Eleanor Bennett, once respected educator, recipient of 3 state teaching awards, the woman who turned Jefferson Elementary into one of the top-performing schools in rural Kentucky. Now I was just Ellie, a 64-year-old convicted felon with a plastic bag of belongings and an envelope containing $22,400. That was everything I had earned working in the prison library at 52 cents an hour, shelving books and helping inmates earn their GEDs. Not much to show for over a decade of my life, but it was all I had left. The October morning felt sharp against my skin. I had forgotten how the wind could cut through you when you weren't surrounded by concrete walls. I had forgotten how loud the world was, how many colors existed beyond gray and beige. My daughter, Patricia, was supposed to pick me up. She had written to me faithfully every month for 11 years, never missing once. But as I stood there watching cars pass, none of them stopped. I waited for 2 hours before I finally understood. She wasn't coming. I took a bus to the town I had once called home, Millbrook, Kentucky. Population 8,400. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where gossip spreads faster than wildfire, where a fall from grace echoes for generations. The bus dropped me at the station downtown, and I walked through streets that were both familiar and foreign. The old hardware store was now a vape shop. The diner where I used to eat breakfast every Saturday had become a chain pharmacy. But Jefferson Elementary was still there, red brick and white columns, looking exactly as it had when I was arrested in my office 11 years ago. I couldn't go to my daughter's house uninvited, not after she hadn't come to pick me up. So I walked to the Millbrook Women's Shelter, a place I had helped fundraise for back when I was someone who mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me as I signed in for a bed. That first night, I lay on a thin mattress staring at the ceiling, thinking about the trial. The evidence had been overwhelming. Forged signatures on checks, my name on accounts I had never opened, financial records showing systematic theft over 3 years. My court-appointed lawyer had done his best, but what could he do against documents that seemed to prove my guilt beyond any doubt? The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. My husband, Richard, had filed for divorce before the verdict even came in. My daughter was 14 when I went to prison. She had grown up without me. The next morning, I went to see Patricia. She lived in a small house on Cedar Street, the house that had belonged to my mother before she passed. I knocked on the door with shaking hands. When my daughter opened it, I barely recognized her. She was 25 now, with tired eyes and a hardness around her mouth that hadn't been there when she was a girl. "Mom." Her voice was flat. "Patty." I waited at the courthouse. "I know. I couldn't come. She didn't invite me in. Can we talk?" She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "There's nothing to talk about. I wrote to you because you're my mother, and I felt obligated. But I can't have you in my life, Mom. Not after what you did. I didn't do it, Patty. I've told you 1,000 times. And I believed you for years. I defended you to everyone. Do you know what that cost me? Kids at school called me the thief's daughter. Dad left town because he couldn't stand the shame. I had to build my whole life from the wreckage of yours." Her eyes filled with tears. "And then last year, I found the evidence." "What evidence?" "The offshore account statements, hidden in Grandma's attic when I was clearing out her things. An account in the Cayman Islands with $1.2 million in it. Your name on every document." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Patty, I never had an offshore account. I don't even know how to set one up. The papers had your signature, Mom, your social security number, everything." She wiped her eyes. "I wanted to believe you were innocent. I wanted it so badly. But how can I ignore what I found with my own hands? Can I see these documents?" I burned them. I couldn't stand to look at them anymore. My heart sank. Whatever evidence had been planted to frame me, it was gone now. "Patty, please, someone set me up. I don't know who or why, but I swear to you, on my mother's grave, I never stole a penny from those children." My daughter looked at me for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't do this." She went back inside and closed the door. I stood on that porch for 10 minutes, unable to move. Then I walked to the only place that had ever made sense to me, the school. Jefferson Elementary looked the same, but the sign out front now read Jefferson Elementary Dr. Marcus Webb, Principal. Marcus Webb, the name stirred something in my memory. He had been the assistant principal when I was arrested, an ambitious man in his 30s who had always seemed a little too eager, a little too friendly. I remembered how quickly he had taken over after my arrest, how smoothly the transition had gone. I sat on a bench across the street and watched the children pour out for recess. Their laughter carried across the autumn air, and I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. I had loved those children, every single one. The prosecution had painted me as a monster who stole their lunch money, but I had given 22 years of my life to that school. I had worked 60-hour weeks. I had spent my own money on supplies when the budget fell short. And in return, I had been branded a thief. "Mrs. Bennett?" I looked up to see a young woman standing nearby, maybe mid-20s, with curly brown hair and nervous eyes. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "It's me, Daisy Crawford. I was in 4th grade when it all happened. Daisy Crawford." The name clicked into place. A shy girl with pigtails who had struggled with reading until I personally tutored her after school for an entire year. She had cried when I was arrested. "Daisy." I tried to smile. "My goodness, you've grown up." "I work here now. 4th grade teacher." She glanced around nervously. "I shouldn't be talking to you. Dr. Webb said if anyone saw you on school property, we should call the police." "I understand. I'll leave." "Wait." She bit her lip. "Mrs. Bennett, I need to tell you something. Something I've wanted to tell you for years, but I was scared. I was just a kid, and nobody would have believed me." My heart began to pound. "What is it, Daisy?" "The night before you were arrested, I forgot my jacket in the classroom. My mom brought me back to get it around 8 p.m. The school was supposed to be empty, but I saw Mr. Webb in your office. He was at your computer. When he saw me, he got really angry and told me to go home and never tell anyone I had seen him there. He said if I told, bad things would happen to my family." Her voice trembled. "I was 9 years old, Mrs. Bennett. I was terrified." I grabbed her hand. "Daisy, are you saying Marcus Webb was in my office the night before the audit found those fake financial records?" "Yes, ma'am. I've thought about it every day for 11 years. When you were convicted, I told myself maybe I had imagined it, but I didn't imagine it. I know what I saw." The pieces began to click into place. Marcus Webb had access to my office, my computer, my signature. He knew the school's financial systems inside and out, and he had benefited enormously from my downfall, rising from assistant principal to principal overnight. "Daisy, would you be willing to tell this to someone official? The police or a lawyer?" Her face went pale. I don't know. Dr. Webb is powerful in this town now. He's on the city council. He has connections everywhere. If I accuse him and nobody believes me, I understand." I squeezed her hand. "Think about it. That's all I ask." She nodded and hurried back toward the school. I watched her go, my mind racing. For 11 years, I had insisted I was innocent, but I had never known who had actually framed me. Now I had a name. Marcus Webb. That night at the shelter, I couldn't sleep. I had $22,400 to prove my innocence and rebuild my life. It seemed like a lot until I started calculating. Shelter fees after the free period, $60 a week. Food, $25 a week. Transportation, $15 a week. If I wanted to hire a lawyer or investigator, those costs would eat through my savings in months. I pulled out a small notebook I had kept in prison and started tracking every expense. Day 1. $4 for a sandwich. $2 for bus fare. $22,394 remaining. The next morning, I went to the public library to use their computers. I researched everything I could find about Marcus Webb. He had done well for himself. Principal of the Year 3 times. Head of the Kentucky Educators Association. A beautiful house on the outskirts of town. A wife named Sandra who ran a successful real estate business, 2 children in private school. But the more I dug, the more I found odd details. Sandra's real estate company had started just 2 months after my conviction, with a surprising amount of initial capital for a new business. The Webbs had paid cash for their house, something unusual for a public school principal's salary. Marcus had also taken several expensive vacations to the Cayman Islands over the years, the same place Patricia had mentioned the offshore accounts. I printed the articles, adding $2.50 to my expense list. Then I searched for wrongful conviction lawyers in Kentucky. Most charged consultations fees I couldn't afford. But one name kept coming up in free legal aid searches. Miranda Jackson, a young attorney who had started a nonprofit called the Kentucky Innocence Project. Her office was in Louisville, 2 hours away. I spent $35 on a bus ticket and made an appointment. When I walked into her cluttered office, Miranda Jackson turned out to be a black woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Dr. Bennett," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I've read about your case. The evidence against you was substantial. The evidence was fabricated. I was framed by my assistant principal, who is now the principal and a respected member of the community. That's a serious accusation. I have a witness. A woman who was a child at the time, who saw Marcus Webb in my office the night before the audit, accessing my computer." Miranda leaned forward. "Tell me everything." I told her about Daisy, about the offshore accounts Patricia had found, about Webb's suspicious financial success. Miranda listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Here's the problem, Dr. Bennett. Eyewitness testimony from an adult about something she saw as a scared 9-year-old is not strong evidence. The documents your daughter found are destroyed. Everything else is circumstantial. To get your conviction overturned, we need something concrete. Bank records, emails, testimony from someone directly involved in the fraud. How do I get that? You investigate. Carefully and legally. If you find something solid, bring it to me, and I'll take your case pro bono." I thanked her and left, feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. Investigation wasn't something I had ever done. I was an educator, not a detective. But I had no choice. Back in Millbrook, I started watching Marcus Webb. I learned his routine. He arrived at school at 7 a.m. and left at 5 p.m. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he had dinner at the country club with local businessmen. On Saturdays, he played golf. His wife, Sandra, showed expensive properties to wealthy clients from Lexington and Louisville. They went to church every Sunday, sitting in the front pew like the perfect family. I needed help. My $22,400 was shrinking, and I couldn't do this alone. I posted a discreet ad online, looking for research assistants. One response stood out. A young man named Terrence Williams, 26 years old, a recent journalism graduate who couldn't find work because newspapers were dying. He was hungry, smart, and willing to work cheap. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, where nobody would recognize me. Terrence was tall and serious, with the kind of intensity I recognized from my best students. "Why do you want this job?" I asked. "Because I believe in the truth, and I need to pay rent. You're offering both. I can only pay $12 an hour, maximum 20 hours a week. I've worked for less. When do I start?" Terrence proved invaluable. He had access to databases I didn't know existed, skills in tracking financial records, and connections at the state records office. Within 2 weeks, he had found something interesting. "Look at this." He showed me his laptop, Sandra Webb's real estate company. I traced the initial capital investment. It came from an LLC registered in Delaware called Bright Future Holdings. Guess who else that LLC paid money to? Who? A consulting firm in the Cayman Islands called Caribbean Financial Services, the same firm that managed those offshore accounts your daughter found. My hands shook. So the money from the school theft went to an offshore account, then to an LLC, then to Sandra Webb's business? That's what it looks like. The Webbs have been slowly laundering your stolen money for 11 years. Can we prove Marcus Webb set up the offshore account? Not yet. But I found something else. Terrence pulled up another document. The forensic accountant who testified at your trial, Gregory Hansen. He was the one who traced all the fake signatures and fraudulent transactions to you. I remember him. His testimony destroyed me. Well, Gregory Hansen died 5 years ago, heart attack, but his widow still lives in Frankfurt. And according to his obituary, he struggled with guilt in his final years. Kept telling his wife he had made a terrible mistake in his career. You think he knew the evidence was fabricated? I think it's worth asking his widow. The trip to Frankfurt cost me $45 in bus fare and lunch, $21,890 remaining. But it was worth every penny. Mary Hansen was a frail woman in her 70s, living alone in a small house filled with photos of her late husband. Mrs. Hansen? I'm Eleanor Bennett. Your husband testified at my trial 11 years ago. Recognition flickered in her eyes. The school principal. The embezzlement case. Yes, ma'am. I spent 11 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. I told Greg something wasn't right about that case. He said the evidence was too perfect, too clean. Real financial fraud is messy, he said. This was like someone had drawn a map straight to your door. Did he ever say anything more specific? He was approached after the trial by a man who paid him $50,000 to destroy his original notes and never speak about the case again. Greg took the money. We needed it. I was sick. The medical bills were crushing us. Tears welled in her eyes. He never forgave himself. He said he had sent an innocent woman to prison, but by then it was too late to do anything about it. Who paid him, Mrs. Hansen? Did Greg ever mention a name? He said the man was a lawyer, worked for someone in Millbrook. That's all he knew. A lawyer. Someone had hired a lawyer to bribe the forensic accountant. This was bigger than just Marcus Webb. Back in Millbrook, I had Terrence research lawyers connected to the Webbs. One name kept appearing. Howard Chambers, a corporate attorney in Lexington who had represented Sandra Webb's real estate company in several transactions. Howard Chambers had also been Marcus Webb's college roommate. They've been friends for 40 years, Terrence said. Chambers handles all of Webb's legal affairs. If anyone helped set you up, it's him. How do we get him to talk? We don't. He's a lawyer. He's protected by privilege and has no incentive to confess. Terrence paused. But there might be another way. Chambers had an assistant for 15 years, a woman named Ruth Patterson. She retired last year. According to her Facebook, she moved to Florida because she was disgusted with how lawyers operate. We tracked down Ruth Patterson to a retirement community in Sarasota. I couldn't afford to fly, so I spent $180 on a Greyhound bus ticket and endured a 22-hour journey, $21,200 remaining. Ruth Patterson was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who greeted me with suspicion when I knocked on her door. I don't talk to reporters or lawyers anymore. I'm neither, Mrs. Patterson. I'm Eleanor Bennett. I spent 11 years in prison for embezzlement, and I believe your former boss helped frame me. Her expression shifted. You're that school principal from Kentucky. Yes, ma'am. Come inside. Over iced tea. Ruth told me what she knew. Howard Chambers was corrupt. I didn't realize how corrupt until the end of my career, but I saw things, heard things. The Bennett case, the one where you went to prison, I remember when Marcus Webb came to the office about that. It was months before anything became public. He and Howard spent hours behind closed doors, planning something. Do you know what? They were setting up offshore accounts and creating false paper trails. Howard bragged about it afterward, said it was his most elegant work. He called it the perfect frame. I should have reported it, but I was scared. Howard knew people who could make problems disappear. Would you be willing to testify to this? Ruth hesitated. I have documents. I made copies of everything before I left, just in case. Call it insurance. She went to a safe in her bedroom and returned with a thick folder. Bank statements, emails, the whole scheme. I've been holding on to these for 3 years, waiting for someone to come asking. I could barely breathe. Why didn't you go to the police? Because Howard Chambers has connections everywhere, and I was nobody. But if you have a lawyer willing to take this on, I'll testify. I'm old. I'm tired of being scared. And I don't want to die knowing I let an innocent woman rot in prison. I flew home this time, spending $280 on a last-minute ticket, $20,400 remaining. The money was draining fast, but I finally had real evidence. When I showed Miranda Jackson the documents Ruth had given me, her eyes went wide. This is it, Dr. Bennett. This is what we needed. bank records showing Webb and Chambers setting up the offshore accounts, emails discussing how to make the fraud look like your work. This is enough to petition for a new investigation. What happens now? I file a motion to reopen your case. The Attorney General's office will review the evidence. If they find it compelling, they'll investigate Webb and Chambers. It could take months. Months. I had barely enough money to survive that long. But I had no choice. The investigation took 5 months. 5 months of living in a tiny rented room above a garage, working part-time at a grocery store, bagging groceries for $9 an hour. 5 months of waiting and hoping and praying. Terrence kept digging, finding more evidence. We discovered that Marcus Webb had embezzled not $2.3 million, but over $4 million from the school over a decade, using the techniques Howard Chambers had developed. He had pinned the first wave of theft on me, then continued stealing after I went to prison. We also found 2 other teachers who had quietly complained about financial irregularities over the years. Both had been fired for performance issues shortly after raising concerns. Both were willing to testify. In March, 11.5 years after my conviction, the Kentucky State Police arrested Marcus Webb at Jefferson Elementary in front of his students and staff. Howard Chambers was arrested at his law office the same day. Sandra Webb was arrested trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with 2 suitcases full of cash. The evidence was overwhelming. Ruth Patterson's documents, the testimony of Daisy Crawford, bank records that Terrence had uncovered. The pattern of theft that continued long after I was supposedly behind bars. The jury in Webb's trial deliberated for less than 3 hours. 1 month later, I stood in the same courtroom where I had been convicted 11 years ago. The same judge, now elderly and gray, looked down at me with something I had never expected to see. Shame. Dr. Bennett, on behalf of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, I offer my deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice you have suffered. Your conviction is hereby vacated. Your record is expunged. You are officially and unequivocally innocent. I couldn't speak. Miranda squeezed my hand. In the gallery, I heard someone crying and turned to see my daughter, Patricia, tears streaming down her face. After the hearing, Patty ran to me and threw her arms around my neck. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I burned those documents. I'm sorry I wasn't there." I held her tight. "You were a child when this started, sweetheart, and you believed what everyone told you. That's not your fault. Can you ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive. We're going to start over, both of us." Kentucky law provided compensation for wrongful imprisonment, $52,000 per year, up to a cap. After 11 years, I was entitled to $572,000. It seemed like a fortune. It seemed like nothing compared to what I had lost. But it was a new beginning. With the money, I did what felt right. I paid Terrence $40,000, enough to start his own investigative journalism website focused on wrongful convictions. His work had been instrumental in everything. I set up a scholarship fund in Daisy Crawford's name at Jefferson Elementary, $75,000 for students who wanted to become teachers. Her courage in coming forward had saved me. I gave Ruth Patterson $50,000 as a thank you for keeping those documents all those years. I paid for Mary Hanson's medical expenses and made sure she was comfortable for the rest of her days. Her husband had been corrupted, but his guilt had eventually led to the truth. And with the remaining money, I started a nonprofit called Second Chances for Educators, dedicated to supporting teachers and administrators who had been wrongfully accused of misconduct. We provide legal resources, investigate questionable terminations, and advocate for due process in education employment. Terrence serves on our board. Patricia and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. She had carried guilt for years about not believing me, about not fighting harder. But I told her what I told Joey in that garden. She was a child when it happened. The adults in her life had failed her, not the other way around. She's married now, with a baby daughter she named Eleanor. I babysit every Thursday. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 25 years for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Howard Chambers got 18 years and was disbarred. Sandra Webb got 12 years and had to forfeit every asset she had accumulated from my stolen money. The school district recovered over $3 million. Last month, I visited Jefferson Elementary for the first time since my arrest. The new principal, a young woman named Dr. Tamika Ross, had invited me for a ceremony. They were renaming the school library the Eleanor Bennett Library, in honor of what I had contributed during my 22 years as principal. I stood in that library surrounded by children and teachers and community members, and I thought about the 11 years I had lost. The birthdays I missed with my daughter, the grandchild I almost never knew, the career that was stolen from me in its prime. Some days, the bitterness still rises in my throat, but then I look at what has come after. A daughter who believes in me, a granddaughter who will grow up knowing her grandmother was innocent, an organization that helps others fight for the truth, a community that finally knows the real story. People ask me if I regret anything about how I handled my case. I tell them I regret not finding Daisy sooner. I regret not having the resources to investigate earlier. I regret every day I spent in that prison knowing I was innocent. But I don't regret never giving up. I don't regret spending every dollar I had on the truth. I don't regret believing that justice, however delayed, was still possible. My mother used to say, "Ellie, the truth is like water. It always finds a way through." She was right. It took 11 years and $22,000 and more heartache than I can describe, but the truth found its way through. Last week, Daisy Crawford was named Teacher of the Year at Jefferson Elementary. She called me crying, saying none of it would have been possible if I hadn't believed in her when she was a struggling 9-year-old with a reading problem. I told her the same thing I tell everyone who asks about my case. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. Sometimes a child's memory is worth more than all the expert testimony in the world. And sometimes justice doesn't come on our schedule, but it comes. That's not nothing. That's everything.